Hello. Gosh, what a turnout. This is fantastic. Thank you so much to everybody for coming today. This is Manchester, if you didn't know it. I've come up from Birmingham. We can chat about where we've come from in a bit, it's all right. I'm Sheri Hughes. I'm the UK Diversity and Inclusion Director for Page Group, and I will be your host for today. So let me just get through some of the basic housekeeping bits and pieces that we need to talk about. So no fire drill, expected. So if you hear a noise, please vacate via the fire exit. I'm sure somebody here will help you there. Don't follow me, because I clearly don't know what I'm talking about. But also, please be interactive today and share that you are here on Twitter. We'd love you to get involved. Oh, actually, I think, hang on, here we go. Yeah, we'd love to kind of get the message out that we're here today, and please brag about how many people are in the room, because that looks really good from up here. The hashtag is #PageBreakfast, so please make sure you put that in there. So what's today going to be all about? Shortly, I should introduce you to our keynote speaker, but basically the setup of today is that Dan's going to come up and do a speech, and then we're going to do a panel Q&A with two extra lovely ladies who we'll introduce in a little while. So I guess what's today all about? I mean, if you think about D&I strategies, and it's a hot topic for lots of businesses, and has been for a while, I think, certainly in some areas. And I always try and think ahead of something like this. What does it really mean? Okay, I sit in D&I, so for me, this is my everyday. But you know, we don't just do it for fun. We do it because there is a real outcome to it, and it improves your business, it improves retention, it improves engagement, it improves productivity. And let's make no mistake, that's going to be key for everybody. So there's lots of things to this. And I try and look around me, and I think, gosh, who does it really well? You know, who really stands out as an inclusive leader? And sadly, the newspapers have been slightly awash with someone who I think is an example of how not to be an inclusive leader. But I did kind of try and look outside of that a little bit, and I'm going, right, okay, well, if he's a good example of what isn't a good leader, what should it look like? And I was just trying to think, if you take government, and if you take our world leaders, and if you take how a country or how a world comes together and performs, it's not because they do it any one way. It's because they talk to law enforcement. It's because they talk to education. It's because they talk to their people. It's because they speak to people in different cultures and they go, right, how can we work together? They go to seek different opinion. Because actually, you're only going to get better if you learn and you're open to suggestions and innovation. And loosely, that's what inclusive leadership is. You know, you shouldn't just be doing it on your own. You know, groupthink is a horrible term, one should be completely obliterated. But let's think about it. You know, how do you get change? How do you get richness of thought? And that is by going to somebody who doesn't think the same way as you. Because actually, you get a better solution by bringing your ideas together. And really, that's what today is going to be about. You know, I really want everyone to be open-minded today and think about, you might have done something one way for a really long time, but you know what? This world is changing. And if you don't get on board, you will be left behind. So please do think about how you can challenge your own thinking and who is going to help you do that. So part of what brought us today is we did a survey and we looked at why employers were leaving their organisation. So we surveyed 2,000 British workers, and we partnered with the CEDA for that, which is where Dan works, and he's going to talk about it in a minute. But just to say, it was focused around 5 key factors. So on that note, I'm going to introduce Dan to the stage, Dan Robertson, who's going to talk us through it all.
Thank you. Morning, everybody. Wow, it is like literally like standing remotely.
Yeah.
So morning. So Dan Robertson from Vicida Consulting. Some of you may know who we are. We essentially work all over the world, and we advise corporations on a number of key topics. Really, one is, in fact, one of the things that we're really interested in is something very simple, and the simplicity is this: what are the dynamics or the ingredients which create high-performing teams? That's what we're really interested in, actually. And how does inclusivity align to that? I have to say, in terms of best practice, I can't stand here in Manchester with Paige and not give Paige a shout out, actually. So I've been working with Paige for probably like 3 years, actually, on and off. And Sheri wouldn't do this, but I can do this, actually. I think Paige have won a whole bunch of awards around what they're doing for a particular reason, because you have people like Sheri and others who are absolutely committed to this agenda, actually. So I'm super pleased when they called me and said, Dan, we want to survey a whole bunch of UK employers to figure out what they think around D&I. Would you work in partnership with us? Hell yeah, let's go for it. So in terms of the context, we did do a survey of 2,000 people, and we framed it around some of the psychology and some of the research in terms of what are the ingredients of high-performing teams. So I'll kind of share that stuff with you. But I want to do a bit of scene setting, actually. And some of the scene setting is, well, let's think about where we are today and what are the kind of drivers in terms of where we're going. Now, what's interesting about this is that some people are clearly at different stages of their journey, actually. And a lot of people are talking about diversity as if that's the magic ingredient to high-performing teams. We know clearly that's not the case. And I think it's important that we frame that to say, what we need is organizations which clearly are not populated by people that look the same, sound the same, think the same, because it does fall into groupthink, essentially. But there are these kind of 6 key ingredients which create high-performing teams. One is diversity, actually, and we know through all the research, when you have people that come from different backgrounds, think differently, come from different cultural backgrounds, etc., it adds a different frame of reference to organizational decision-making. So diversity does lead to innovation, creativity, etc. But diversity alone doesn't help us, actually. And what most organizations are doing, they're doing something with good intention, but with negative consequences. And what they're doing is this. They're hiring people who are diverse, but when they hire them in, they say this: we've hired you because you're different, and now you're here. Can you be a bit more like us? and it's really, really interesting. And actually, I have to say, this is not just UK. This is a thing that I see all over the world, actually. You could be anywhere in New York, Sao Paulo, whatever. This is the interesting dynamic. And what we have seen globally, we've seen some positives, actually. So particularly if you look at some metrics like gender, we definitely obviously see more women in the workplace. But more importantly, we see more women moving up the organizational pipeline, and that's really great. We've seen some success, but far limited success in relation to race. But we have an interesting dynamic, and the dynamic I see in organizations is essentially high levels of organizational diversity, but low levels of organizational inclusivity. That doesn't work in terms of high-performing teams. So if we want to be solid about this, we have to align diversity with this sense of inclusion, or what we call belonging. And how do we define belonging? I mean, we're used to conversations around, authenticity and the rest of it, but belonging is really about when you step into the world of work, can you be yourself? Can you be yourself and reveal your vulnerabilities and the rest of it? And I think that's important, which aligns to the next one, which is psychological safety. I was having a conversation with Kate Headley, who's one of my superheroes, I have to say, actually, this morning. And Kate and I were talking about these things, and Google did some research, actually. And it's a 2-year project. It's called a Google Aristotle project, and you can Google Google's project, if that makes sense to anyone. And they asked one simple question, which was, what are the ingredients to a team which is really high performing? And one of the key factors of the Google Aristotle project was very simple: psychological safety. Without psychological safety, you cannot have a high performing team. And organizations are good at taking psychological safety and stripping it out. And that's really not good in terms of what we're trying to do. So we need to think about that. Meaning is one as well. How do you generate meaning and creativity? And then the other one is what the management psychobabble is, basically divine discontent. And that's some research by McKinsey. And they talk about, if you have diverse inclusion, do you create team dynamics essentially where people can be creative and criticize each other and all of that? So do we have this kind of creative conflict, if you like? And again, that leads to innovation, creativity. Now, all of this stuff is fundamentally underpinned by the principles of inclusive leadership. Now, the role of a leader, as we all know, is to set the organizational tone. The leader is the shadow. They cast the shadows in organizations. Sheri did talk about Donald Trump. He's obviously not an actually, I've mentioned his name. Yeah, she didn't mention his name. He is the name that shall not be mentioned. Yeah. But it is interesting actually around where we're going as a world actually, and not just millennials, but what do we want from our leaders? And when you talk to the professors at Harvard University, they will tell you certain things. They will tell you that globalization is defined by certain factors. It's defined by turbulence, it's defined by uncertainty, unpredictability, but the fourth fundamental factor which defines globalization is diversity. Your future talent, without question, will be increasingly diverse, as will your future external stakeholders, whether they're clients or customers, etc. So any organization which wants to be successful cannot be so unless it factors in the principles of diversity. But we also know that factoring diversity alone will not get us anywhere unless we make a strategic alignment between that and organizational inclusivity. And it is the role of the organizational leader to do this. We at Viewpoint Consulting have done an enormous amount of research on inclusive leadership, which I'll talk to you later. But I do want to share with you the findings from the survey we did. You can obviously get a copy. I think after today, an email will go around so people can get copies of the research and the rest of it. Because if I went through every single finding with you, we would probably be here all week. So I don't intend to do that. But there was some really interesting stuff which came out of the survey, which I do want to share with you actually. So we'll go through those, and then we can probably explore a bit more in the Q&A. Just to say, Sheri talked about the 5 themes. So we wanted to measure people's perceptions based on these kind of 5 key areas. So one is around commitment, one is inclusive talent, perceptions of inclusive culture, perceptions of inclusive leadership, and then the 5th one is connectivity. So we asked a whole bunch of questions, as you can imagine, around that. So I'm just going to share some stuff with you. And what I'd encourage you to do is, as we share some of these findings, is maybe just make a mental note of 1 or 2 things which stand out for you, because you might want to ask the panel maybe some questions around some of these. But some interesting questions aligned to commitment was this. So the first thing around commitment is firstly, well, is diversity and inclusion seen as the priority where I work? That's the starting point in terms of any organization. Do you think that your organizational leaders are essentially committed to this? And on the surface, if you look at the results, so diversity is seen as a priority. Well, 42% of people agree that yes, they think diversity is a priority. 19% of people disagree with that, which on the surface feels like a low number. But we're almost heading towards 20% of the people that we surveyed don't think that their leaders see diversity and inclusion as a priority. That's quite a big percentage. But what's interesting is you've got 39% of people that are saying, I'm not sure. I don't agree or disagree with that statement. So you've got a whole body of people that are saying, I don't know whether my leaders see diversity and inclusion as an organization, as a strategic priority. That's quite a big deal actually when you think about that. Second one, obviously, is senior leaders at my work act as inclusive champions. This is a fundamental question, actually. And as you can see from the results, 36% of people, in fact, I'm going to use a different phraseology, only 36% of people agree that senior leaders act as inclusive champions in their organization. So we've got the majority of people either disagreeing or not sure. And you can see the results there. And I'll just read the results out because I'm conscious people at the back might not be able to see the slide. So we've got 21% of people who disagree. So they're basically saying that they don't see their leaders as diversity champions. And then you've got 43% of people that neither agree nor disagree. So I think that kind of in the middle, the neither disagree or agree is quite a big deal actually. So that's interesting in terms of that. We have been able to aggregate these results actually by things like gender, ethnicity, etc. So I'm just going to encourage you to read the report because that's interesting. These results actually, there's no significant differential in terms of gender for these 2. So then in terms of inclusive talent, one of the questions here was, so work tasks are assigned fairly and with transparency. So 60% of people agree with that. That's a fairly positive response, actually. You've got 12% of people disagreeing. But again, interesting, you've got 28% of people neither agreeing nor disagreeing with the fact that they think that work is assigned fairly and transparently. And we know from all of the research that the assignment of work is fundamental in terms of your opportunity to progress within an organisation. So these questions have been designed around what are we trying to look at. Question here around protected characteristics and background. So do we think that your protected characteristics, so those characteristics based on race, gender, disability, sexual orientation, age, etc., do you think those characteristics, as covered under the Equality Act, or your social background, does it have an impact in terms of career progression and opportunities? Agree, well, actually the question is personal characteristics and background do not impact. So you've got 58% of people agreeing that they think that their identity doesn't impact, but you've got 15% of people who disagree with that. So essentially you've got, this is called like an inverse question. So you've got 15% of people who are essentially saying, actually, I think that my identity does impact my career progression. And also, interestingly, again, you've got this neither agree nor disagree. So you've got 27% of people saying, in my organisation, I'm not convinced that my social background doesn't impact on my career opportunities. If you add together the 27 and the 15, that's not a good result in terms of our findings, actually. So it says there's a hell of a lot of work for organisations to think about there. So inclusive culture, my organisation promotes a range of flexible and agile working practices. We know that I've been working with organisations for over a decade, and been talking about the need for flexible, agile working. Not just for people with disabilities or working mothers or millennials, but for everybody, because we know that's where the world is going. That's the trend. What we've got here as an interesting result is we've got basically about 50%, so we've got 51% of people saying that they think their organisation does promote flexible or agile working. But again, we've got 17% of people saying their organisation doesn't promote that in an effective way. And also we've got 32% of people saying not sure. If I was to do an analysis of all of your organisations, which you can breathe easy because I'm not going to. But what I would imagine that I would find is you've got all your policies, your processes, etc. on paper. But I think this is the not sure is probably something to do with whether they're confident the organisation promotes it in an effective way. So I think it's something less of a policy issue and more of a kind of commitment issue from managers and leaders and the rest of it. So next question around inclusive cultures, which is our bosses use their power and privilege to promote a speak-up culture that challenges biases and inappropriate behaviour. Now, this is obviously super topical at the moment because of things like the Me Too movement. We've had lots of conversations in the media around, inappropriate behaviour and all of that. So it's important to think about, well, how do people feel about this? So we have got a fairly useful result there. So we've got 42% of people agreeing that their bosses do use their power and privilege to promote a speak-up culture and challenge bias, inappropriate behaviour, etc. We do have 29% of people that disagree with that statement. So 29% of people are saying, you can read it in a number of ways, but 29% of people are saying they're not convinced that their bosses speak up essentially when things are not fair or when we have these behaviours which are inappropriate. Now, the way we also need to read that is not that managers and bosses don't see it, but they do see it, but they're essentially turning a blind eye. That is not a good result, actually. And we also have, as you can see, we have 39% of people that neither agree nor disagree. And I think what's really fascinating about all these results is these huge neither disagreeing or agreeing, actually. People are just not convinced that their organisations are championing inclusive work cultures. And then in terms of inclusive leadership, which is something that we were really keen to measure, our senior leaders live and breathe inclusivity by ensuring their behaviours align to organisational values. And again, I was having a conversation with Kate Headley this morning about the importance of making sure that individual leaders align their behaviours to organisational values. And there are real problems if people don't do that. And you can see the results there, that 38% of people do agree that their leaders generally would align their behaviour to stated values. But you've got 21% of people that disagree with that statement. So they're basically saying, actually, the way that our leaders behave is against what's stated in terms of our values. And again, you can see that we've got 41% of people that basically neither agree nor disagree. So that's not a good result, actually, in terms of what people are thinking and feeling at the moment. The next one, so remember the importance of psychological safety. Remember the research by Google and actually other studies on psychological safety, that you can't really have a sense of true inclusion or belonging without psychological safety. So we were keen to measure this. So our leaders generate psychological safety by making it safe to be your true self at work. And you can see that 44% of people do agree with that statement, but 17% of people disagree. And then we have this 38% of people that neither agree nor disagree, actually. That would be particularly troubling for me. I mean, in an ideal world, which we would never have, but you really want the agree to be hitting the probably 70, 80% percentile pointage. And that's where we would really start to see an organisation that's valuing belonging and true inclusivity. But we've clearly got a long way to go. And then the final one was just on connectivity. And connectivity is important because that's where you generate idea sharing, innovation, creativity, etc. So I work in a culture that champions the ideas of individuals who think differently. So we've got 47% of people that do agree with that, so that's feeling okay. We've got 19% of people that disagree, so basically saying that they don't work in a culture where they value people that think differently. And again, we've got 35% that neither agree nor disagree with that statement. And then the final one is I work in a culture that doesn't get hung up on hierarchy. Instead, we focus on building relationships with colleagues from all parts of the organisation. You've got almost half, so you've got 49% of people that do agree with that statement, so it's fairly positive. But again, you've got 21% of people that disagree, and you've got 30% of people that neither agree nor disagree. So they are interesting findings, actually, and I think when you look at the report, you'll see that in many ways, we're doing some good stuff, actually. And to be honest, when I benchmark the UK in my head against many of our neighbours, particularly in the EU or lots of other kind of global organisations, we're actually doing quite well. Our commitment to diversity and inclusion is solid in the rest of it. But I think what these results are saying is we've still got a long way to go. So I'm going to encourage you to anchor one of those. So I'm going to give you a lot of data, but just anchor one or two of those in your head. And then you can maybe ask the panel or want to kind of explore those in a bit more detail. But what I thought was important to wrap up with is, well, what can we do, actually? And is there any evidence that says if we do certain things, we get certain results? And the good stuff is that absolutely we can. So there's lots of research. You might have heard of the stuff by Iris Benet from Harvard University. She's done lots of work from behavioural science in terms of what actually works in terms of driving organisational inclusivity. We at Viseed have done lots of work around organisational leadership, inclusive leadership. So we've kind of matched those two together. And I just want to share very briefly with you, because I'm conscious of time, some of the things. There are 6 fundamental traits of inclusive leaders. So one is around inspire. How do leaders, take the opportunity to articulate, those business benefits of diversity and inclusion? I meet leaders all the time that wouldn't know what inspire means if it hit them in the face. Honestly, you get leaders who, they are just, they can't inspire anything, actually. And I think that's really interesting in terms of, well, how can you lead if you can't inspire people who are similar to you, never mind people who are different from you? And some of the actions under inspire is things like championing the ideas of people who think differently. Integrity is a fundamental competency for any leader, actually. It's a fundamental competency, clearly, for inclusive leaders. And underpinning integrity is a concept of trust, actually. And it's important that, if we think back to that question around, do we think that leaders align their behaviours to organisational values? and we have a whole bunch of people saying, I'm not sure, that's an indicator of integrity. That's saying we're not sure that we can trust you and you are integral in terms of your behaviours. One of the things to build integrity is this notion of making sure that you do speak up when things are not fair and when you see behaviours. There are lots of organisational leaders that see stuff and they just simply turn a blind eye. Insight is the third one. You can't be an inclusive leader if you don't have insight into yourself, into your own ways of working, your own biases, your own ways of thinking. You can't have insight, if you can't be an inclusive leader if you don't know what your own personal motivations are. And you absolutely cannot be an inclusive leader if you don't have insight into the experiences of people who are different from you. So building insight is definitely a fundamental competency of an inclusive leader. And we're often asked the question around, well, how do you generate or how do you build insight? And one of the things that I'm often encouraging organizations to do is to measure a sense of organizational belonging. And it feels a bit nebulous. We can measure diversity because diversity is just a numbers game. You can tick a whole bunch of boxes and you can figure out, what your organization looks like. So how do we measure belonging, or how do you measure organizational inclusivity? Well, you can do that actually. You can do it relatively simply. We've just done a whole bunch of measurement around what the UK population is thinking, and you can do it in your own organizations in terms of things like the employee engagement survey. So those very, very simple questions such as, do you feel your voice is heard by your manager? And if you aggregate that information by gender, race, religion, age, etc., it gives you a sense of how people think and feel based on their identity. So I would encourage you not to think about these concepts of inclusion, belonging as soft and fluffy and nebulous. You can measure them in a fairly hard way. Inquisitive, inclusive leaders pay attention to unwritten rules and the patterns of behaviour. I think to be inquisitive, if you think about the UK, we have a whole bunch of kind of celebratory events. So, in October, it's Black History Month. In November, it's LGBT History Month. We have International Women's Day. We have International Day of Disabilities. I actually spend a whole bunch of my time hanging out at women's development networks. And I do, honestly. And when it was actually last October, they had an exhibition. It's a Black Power exhibition at the Tate Modern. And I went along to the exhibition with a couple of colleagues, and it was genuinely super insightful for me in terms of the experiences of African Americans and that whole kind of Black Power movement and all of that. And I think what we do as human beings is we hang out with people that we're comfortable with. And if you want to be an inclusive leader, we have to start to just step out of that comfort zone and essentially to step into difference. And it means very simple things like, when it's International Women's Day, if you're a guy, go along and, support that event and champion the rest of it. And you can apply that principle to race, gender, etc. Individuate. Individuate is psychobabble for don't lump everybody together. So just because you might be part of a protected characteristic, it doesn't mean that the experiences and the wants and needs of all women, for example, are the same. So it's about having those individual conversations and not lumping people together. And then the final thing is around investment. The main point here is that inclusive leaders do stuff. And the reason they do stuff is because they want to make stuff happen. And the things that you can do, and this is really interesting, which aligns to the research from Iris Benet in Harvard, is inclusive leaders adopt the principle of what's called amplification. Amplification is developed in the White House under Barack Obama. And the basic deal is this, is that women would make a suggestion, the classic thing, be in a team meeting, a female would make a suggestion, not really picked up, a guy would make a suggestion, be like, hey, that's amazing. So the women were like, right, we've had enough of this. So what they started to do was to informally collude together. So they'd say, right, Jane, if you make a suggestion, assuming it's a good one, I'm gonna speak up straight away and champion that. And so they started to do that, and then they started to extend the principle of amplification by saying if somebody made a decision, they would send an email around afterwards and say, hey Jane, that was a great idea. So you're really kind of amplifying the voices of people who are different and giving credit to it. Barack Obama, this is a true story actually, he actually got wind of what they were doing, he figured it out, and he loved the policy, and he essentially formalized it. Now, it doesn't have to apply to gender, it apply to race or any other group, but it's really about amplifying the voices of people who are different. And you can do that through, who's on conference panels, who's getting to do presentations, who's in key meetings, etc. So amplification we know works. It's interesting around, there's been some research from the Center of Talent and Innovation based in New York, and they've done an analysis of the greatest impact between mentoring and sponsorship. Now, lots of us are familiar with mentoring and sponsorship. Mentoring is useful. I wouldn't advocate not using it, but if you want to be more concrete around addressing the pipeline, sponsorship without question has shown to be much more impactful. And sponsorship is about identifying talent that's different from you early in the pipeline and being the advocate. So it's about making sure difference is allocating the stretched work, given time in key meetings, their ideas are championed, etc. So definitely move towards sponsorship. And then the final principle is what's measured gets done. I'm not a fan of diversity quotas, I have to say, but I am a fan of diversity targets and KPIs. And why wouldn't we be? Because in our world of work, we measure all sorts of things in organisations. And if we see diversity inclusion as a business priority, why would we not want to put a whole bunch of KPIs and measurements around it? Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Dan. That was fascinating. And I think just on a personal note, one thing that really struck me, just at the end when Dan was talking about Individuate, was we are all different. I have two daughters who are very close in age. They're 4 and 5. And clearly they're made from my husband's and my DNA. They couldn't be more different to one another. And that just is so true. Everybody is so different, irrelevant of what group you sit in. And I think there was just a couple of other things I wanted to add before I'll introduce our other ladies up to the panel, is that so many of these stats were so true because, in this day and age, we are going to be dominated by millennials in the workforce in a huge way in the next sort of 5 or 6 years. And actually a really important thing for them, because generally they don't stay in roles too often these days. And so once you attract them into an organisation, and probably a lot of you in the room as well, that, okay, it's one thing that attracts you to an organisation, but all of this is what keeps you there. And there was a recent report done by Deloitte that said 64% of millennials will stay beyond 5 years if the leadership had D&I as a top priority. So this really matters to a lot of people, and they can tell it as soon as they get into an organisation. They can tell if they feel like they're being included or that they truly matter and their opinion is different and that that's embraced. So please don't take any of this too lightly, because quite rightly, diversity is just a number if you don't have inclusion. They really must come together. So on that note, let me introduce Ngozi and Kate up to the stage as well, please. And what we're going to do now, they're deciding where they're going to sit. Who's going to sit? Going to be a rose between two thorns here, Dan? Wherever you like, ladies. Thank you. And so I'm going to kick this off, asking a few questions, but then we really would like you all out there to get involved as much as possible. So hopefully you've had some thoughts going on in regards to what Dan has talked about this morning. So just so that you are familiar with who these ladies are and what they do, let me start with Kate. Kate's going to introduce herself and tell her what she does.
Welcome everybody, thank you very much for having me along today, and thank you Dan, that was amazing as always. So my name's Kate Headley, I'm one of the directors of the Clear Company. We're an inclusion consultancy. My personal role is I have the privilege of working with organisations and really auditing their diversity and inclusion policy, practice and process. I'm developing the Clear Assured standard, which Michael Page are working really hard on. And they're doing really, really well, and we're incredibly proud. I'm from Manchester. I used to be HR at Manchester City Council when I was 27, which is a long time ago, to be exporting best practice around diversity and inclusion around the world, and very definitely in London. I'm a government advisor on disability and recruitment. I sit on a number of panels with the Cabinet Office as well, which we're also very proud of. Thank you.
Super, thanks, Kate. Ngozi?
Oh, to follow that now.
Yeah.
The pressure. So I'm Ngozi. I'm a co-founder of a company called Aurora Wellness. And we are a productivity and work-life balance coaching consultancy. And we've been operating for 2 years, and really our focus is on getting organisations to understand that mental health and well-being is as fundamental to individual success as physical health and well-being. So yes, before that I used to work for ExxonMobil. I worked there for 16 years and had a lot of experience of some of the things that Dan was talking about that weren't necessarily best practice. And I'm happy to share those with you.
Don't worry, we're going to get to the juicy stuff. So what I thought we'd just start with is maybe could you just give us your opinion on what makes a good inclusive organisation? Just kind of a top tip, what do you look for first?
Yeah, I mean, for us, what we would look for first is an organisation that's really genuinely, authentically prepared to ask those difficult questions and delve under the surface and find out exactly where they are now, and set themselves, as Dan rightly says, some goals and KPIs about where they want to be. So stop guessing, stop throwing initiatives out there, and focus energies and efforts authentically, and that's where the difference will come.
Without doubt, authenticity is so important. Dan, anything you'd like to?
I think, it's not, I think it's interesting actually, because, obviously we do a lot of stuff around leadership, and, leadership, modern styles of leadership, leadership is not here, it's not hierarchical, we see leadership at all levels of the organisation. But I do think it is really important around how leaders set the tone. And there are, many leaders who I meet who are absolutely living and breathing the principles of inclusivity. But the unfortunate thing is they're few and far between. And the thing is your leader or your line manager is the one that affects your day-to-day reality of being at work. And so I think we've got a lot of work to do around that space actually to move the agenda forward.
So just flipping that on its head then, Ngozi, for bearing on what you've just been saying, what was it that you didn't get?
I think there are lots of really great principles and practices that organisations can adopt. And don't get me wrong, ExxonMobil is one of at least once was the largest oil company in the world. We had those principles and policies in place. We had D&I as something that was talked about. And yet, there were, as I was saying to you earlier, Sheri, I was one of 2 black people, or one of 2 non-white people in a department of 150. And neither of us got to a position of senior leadership, despite receiving the same kind of work. So when you were talking about the work assignment, we received the same kind of work. We did the work effectively, we got praised for that, we got rewarded, but when it came to time for progression, that didn't happen. So for me, it's more about blind spots, and people can think that they're being diverse because they've talked about it, and they can think that they're being diverse because they look around the room and 50% of the people are women, so we're obviously diverse, right? But they have a blind spot when it comes to race or sexual preference or orientation or anything else, and that's the issue is really being, like you said, Kate, being honest and open and having the communication, creating those safe spaces where people like myself can say, hang on, I don't feel that we are being inclusive here, and not be looked down on or dismissed as being overly negative. So yeah.
Lip service is too easy, isn't it? It's too easy to say, oh yeah, we're doing it, it's fine. It has to be truly embedded and felt by everybody in the organisation.
Yes, I think the thing is, it's a very difficult conversation. And I can fully understand people's reticence to speak and say, you're right, there aren't a lot of black people or Muslims or homosexuals or whatever in this organisation, because it's as if to imply that they are in some way racist or phobic, and that's not what we're saying. We're saying if we're going to move the needle in any way, you need to talk about it. You need to be honest about what the current situation is, what you'd like it to be, and talk to the people who are the affected parties about how they can help you to create a more inclusive environment.
What do you think the challenges are then? What are the common challenges you see, perhaps Dan and Kate, in organisations in regards to this?
The most common challenge that we see is that organisations, and Dan alluded to it earlier, and Ngozi has just confirmed it, is they have a policy suite in place. And I remember doing a review of one of the big banks, and it was one of the best diversity inclusion policies we've ever seen, as was their recruitment policy. But it's translating that into practice. And that's about assumptions of skills. And I think certainly in the modern organisation where our managers are managing for themselves, so ivory tower HR protecting them is no longer the case. We need to give the skills to that management population to manage and hire inclusively.
Yeah.
So it's the practice, invariably. If we do a desk review and then do a qualitative review and map the two together, it's the qualitative review that shows us what's happening in
Really
practice.
happening,
And that's where the fundamental gap is invariably found.
Yeah, I think that's right. Actually, the other thing that is, I think we all have to have a reality check that the policies and processes that we have in place, they're obviously designed to do certain things. So they're designed to make sure that our decision making is free from bias. But when we look at the data, we know that bias is ingrained within the language and the frameworks that we use. And I've just shared something with you actually. So a report which just came out actually last week. And it's a US organization, and it was their competency framework, and they were measuring the competencies and scores of men and women. And this is what they found. So let's start with the positives. So men, the high ranking competency that men were rated on was analytical skills. So great, we all want people, and this is an organization that values high analytics, so we all want people with analytics, that's really great. The highest ranking positive for women leaders was compassion. Okay, feeling positive still, we want people that are analytical and compassionate, but that falls into the classic stereotype that women are more compassionate as opposed to analytical. And interestingly though, when you continue up the organizational hierarchy, well, what do you want? Do you want compassion or do you want analytics, which is skills-based? I kind of like compassion, but actually need analytics. So that's interesting, right?
Yeah.
Then they looked at the negative ones, and check this out, this is really interesting. The negative results for men was arrogance. Men tend to be arrogant. Okay, stop the press. That's not a surprise. We know that men tend to have overconfidence bias than the other one. But the result for women was something much more serious, which was inept.
Wow.
Now think about that in your hiring process. Do you want to hire, and let's add them together, analytics and arrogant, or compassion and inept? Well, I manage a whole bunch of people, and I definitely don't want anyone in my organisation that's inept.
Yeah.
And then think about who you're moving organisational hierarchy to leadership, or if you're doing a redundancy process. So I think what's really interesting is that our frameworks, which are designed to be free from bias, are loaded with, gendered language, racial language, all of that kind of stuff. So I think we've got a lot of work to do around, digging deep essentially, and trying to neutralise that stuff as much as we can.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. It starts so much earlier. I mean, I work for a recruitment firm, although I'm not frontline recruitment anymore. And, often it is from clients, it's like, can you recruit diversity for us? Just, we'll give it to you. And I think, there's not enough understanding from the organisations themselves that it's their culture that is so critical in honestly recruiting diversity, and more importantly, sustaining having diversity in your business, because if you haven't got an inclusive environment, they're not going to want to stay anyway, are they? And that's a big challenge. So there's been a few things you may or may not have seen in the press recently about certain diversity strands, which I just kind of wanted to draw upon. And not saying this because of the faces I see in the room or anything, but age. There's been a thing at the moment. Yeah, sorry.
Probably the oldest person in the room, anyway.
But we talk about millennials a lot, and there's a lot of reports about millennials. And yes, we know they're going to be 75% of our workforce by 2025. But let's also not forget we have an ageing population, and people want to and need to and can work longer. So there's been a few things out recently about the over 45s in the workplace, but also about the raising the retirement age and which population of women that particularly affected. What do you think about what we're doing about age in the workplace?
I think it's a really interesting discussion because it changes through life cycle, if that makes sense. Because I'm 56, I don't mind sharing that.
She doesn't look it, everyone.
I'm just saying.
Why not?
Plenty of that. And we've got people in the team who are in their 20s, and I have to really catch myself, not making assumptions about what their motivations and needs are in the workplace. Because they're different from mine when I was in my 20s, because the world's a very different place, and they're clearly very different from mine now I'm in my 50s. So I think what we need to do with age is what we've talked about with the other factors, is we need to talk, open, listen, and not assume. I think we track that back to this inclusive leadership discussion. The leader who makes assumptions about what that employee base requires at any stage in their life is going to start to make pretty fundamental mistakes. And the two things will happen. As Dan said earlier, the obvious one is people will leave, and that's easy to measure. And organisations say, well, they didn't fit in anyway. I mean, how often do you hear that in an organisation? And you know, they were never going to stay. They weren't really our type. But the more fundamental is what they'll do is stay and stop performing, and or cause conflict, and most definitely cost you money, and go against productivity. So I think from an age perspective, when you stop putting it in boxes, because I'm a 56-year-old, I might be very different to another 56-year-old, because I've got, I have a disability which I've acquired later in life, I have an elder daughter, I run a business, all of those factors make me who I am. And another 56-year-old might be looking to retire. I'm not, I'm nowhere near in that space. So it's the same thing. Don't make assumptions, ask the questions, and have the discussions. But the fundamental around age is this generation of workforce wants very different things to us. Their level of respect for hierarchy is fundamentally different. We can't expect to assume respect because we brought somebody in to the organisation. We have to earn it as leaders. And I think that's a really very big challenge for leaders today.
They have quite different aspirations, don't they? They want to know, I mean, it's in this Deloitte report, which if you haven't read is quite interesting, that they have much bigger draw to things like whether or not company leaders have got more than just profit kind of on their agenda. They want to know that you care about the moral and the ethical things as well. So there is so much more to it, isn't there?
And the pensions example that you gave there, Sheri, is classic example of good intentions not delivering the right results, because it's a policymaker's decision to have a good intention that actually hasn't delivered to a very large percentage of the audience it was supposed to serve, because the questions weren't asked.
No, that's right. And also I think Kate's raised another really good point there, is that you must remember to bring all of your diversity strands together. So Kate sits in the gender one, she's a mother and she has a disability. Often people don't just sit in one sector. This is about intersectionality. This is about understanding that we're still all the human race, and none of that should be ignored, really. Is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I mean, if you think back to those 6 themes which create high-performing teams, remember one of them was meaning. And I think it is really interesting that when I entered the world of work many years ago, we were used to a world of work which was defined by structure, and you go in, as in the consultancy world anyway, you go in as an associate and you basically work 14 hours a day if you're lucky, and all weekend, and that's just what you do, and all the rest. And the younger generation look at me and they think, it's just off their radar. And I think what's interesting is, as Kate said, they don't respect hierarchy, which I think is a positive thing in the way that we did. But also one of the things that they're looking for is, their primary motivation for work is not financial reward. We know that for sure. So all the research by Daniel Pink from Stanford has shown that there are 3 fundamental motivating factors. We do get out of bed for salary for sure, but one of the things that we want is meaning. And actually, if you think about just the conversations outside, our generation and the younger generation are so tuned into things like the environmental agenda and all of that, and they want to work for an organisation that has meaning as well as other things. And the other final thing that I'd say about millennials is this talk about millennials that want flexible and agile working, which is true. The only thing that I would say about that is I think that conversation can be quite restrictive, because I want to work in a way which is agile. Some days, to be honest with you, I will work 12 hours a day, but some days I'm just not productive, and I think, I'm just going to go to the gym and I'm going to do my work when I'm in that groove. And as long as the work is completed on time, high quality, etc., I think that's an adult way. So I think we need to be mindful around. It's not only millennials that want to work in an agile and flexible way. I think organisations need to sharpen up quite quickly. And the rest of it.
I couldn't agree more. The whole thing about agile working just being for parents as well. I mean, it makes my skin crawl when people say that. It's like, actually, you should be defined by whether or not you're a parent. You know, people still have things they want to do in their private life, and it's how you blend your work and your life throughout the week that's important to you. Do you want to add anything to that, Ngozi? You don't have to.
No, it's just I was going to say it's an excellent point, but it's about what you said about treating people as individuals.
Yeah.
So for me, my primary motivator has never been money. It has always been meaning and a sense of belonging and loyalty. But I'm not a millennial, so
You look at that, doesn't she?
of course I do. Thank you, Sheri. I'll pay you the full. But yes, of course, you treat people as individuals. You speak to them, listen to their concerns, listen to what motivates them, what drives them. It makes the whole issue of creating the right policy and inclusive policy much easier because you're dealing with the individual and not a statistic or a number.
Yeah. I want to move it on to a topic that's kind of quite close to my heart, really, and it's been around in the press quite a bit recently when it comes to working parents, because so often in organisations it's the working mother or the primary caregiver that gets all of the flexibility and understanding and accommodation, but throw in the secondary caregiver, which is normally a father, not always. I completely understand. They don't seem to get the same way. So, and this affected me as well. So when I was pregnant with my first daughter sort of 6 years ago, my husband and I had the chat. Plan was we were both going to go 4 days. We had kids later in life, so therefore that was, going to be a good equal way of doing it. There is no way in the world he could have gone to his employer 6 years ago and said, right, I want to work 4 days, but I'm still ambitious and I still want to move my career on. So I work 3 and he works full time. We've both been promoted since having the children, and yet we both know he wouldn't have been. If we were both working part-time, he wouldn't have been, but it wasn't a problem for me. And I kind of want to throw this out really as one of our working parents, Ngozi. What do you think is going on in regards to how we accommodate all working parents fairly?
In regard to this, the company that I used to work for, that was exactly the problem. Even though we had the flexible working benefits and I'm married to a pager, at that time I decided I wanted to go back to work part-time after my second child. And for the company, even though we had the policy, even though I'd done it previously on the first maternity leave, it wasn't possible this time. So it's still a problem for companies to accommodate flexible working and return to work policies for the primary caregiver. The secondary caregiver hasn't had a look in yet, but it's something that I firmly believe in the next 5, 10, 15 years will become a critical issue because more and more people come from dual career families.
Yeah.
I know very few who aren't, and economically certainly it's an imperative for us now to accommodate 2 working parents and 2 working parents who have successful careers. So I just think it's something that hasn't happened yet. We haven't gotten to the stage where we're at pay parity with women. We haven't gotten to the stage where we're at pay parity for different races or ethnicities. I think this is something that's on the agenda, but is lower down the hierarchy. But not that it's not important, it's absolutely critical. And I think companies will be forced into this issue in the next 5 to 10 years.
There's so many things on their agenda, aren't there?
There are. There's still a long way to go, as we said that. Even though the UK may be advanced compared to other European countries, I'm living proof that there's still a lot of work to do. So yes, I think it's something that just hasn't come up high enough on the agenda.
Kate, you're a working parent as well. What do you think?
Yes, and she's 21 and still like working parent.
Yeah.
I mean, I was saying to you earlier, Sheri, that I've said since I had my daughter, which is 21 years ago, almost to the day, that the challenge for organisations now is the dual income family. And I'm blessed to have a partner who respects my working life and we share everything equally. And that worked reasonably well for me. It's much more difficult for him. You know, the assumption is that the senior exec has a clean shirt and that their underwear drawer's full and that they've got lunch ready and that there's tea on the table. And in the dual income family, that's an assumption that you can't make because the partner's away in London until the Thursday. And I remember doing a particular review about global careers. which are they are set up so you have to have a wife. I mean, it could be a female wife or a male wife. And all of my female friends say they need a wife because an expat role needs somebody to go to another country, absorb themselves in it, and have somebody at home picking up the pieces. So I think from an organisational perspective, Sheri, as we discussed earlier, this is, as Ngozi says, a fundamental shift in thinking that relates back to Dan's point that the world is changing, it's much more diverse, and that traditional sort of family unit that our policies are built around is no longer the case. So the takeaway would be, go back to your policies and make sure that they are set in a way that reflects that changing demographic. And I think the biggest shift needs to be, and we'll talk about this quite a lot, is when the conversation around flexible working happens, it should be about the business making a case not to accept it on business grounds, because you have to run a business, not the individual making a case to have it. I want to be a good neighbour, I want to be a good parent, I want to do some volunteering, people might want to take a sabbatical. I have somebody who walks their dog at 6 o'clock in the morning to keep themselves sane because of the pressures in their life. So if that can be accommodated, I don't understand why we don't do that.
We had, I don't know if you remember, Dan and I did an event a couple of years ago, and we were talking about what work-life blend means to the women in the room. And one lady said, I don't have kids, I don't have a partner, but I love my dogs. And doggy daycare doesn't open until X o'clock, and I have to pick up dogs by this time. She went, and it's accommodated by my business. The room was full of C-suite women, wasn't it? She said, but it's because of my level I get that, not because it's important to me. And it's quite interesting, it doesn't matter what your driver is. That's such a good point. It really doesn't matter. And there shouldn't be a hierarchy of that either. It's like, if that's what's important in your work-life blend, then that's what's important. I don't know if you want to add.
No, I think that's just a really good point. I mean, I don't have children actually. But does that mean that I want to spend all of my time at work? Absolutely not. You know, I've got interests, and not even just interests. I mean, just on a very simple example is, even though we're doing a morning breakfast, I'm not a morning person actually. So the fact that I've been relatively...
You've been up all night, seeing what you do.
Absolutely. So if I haven't made any sense at all, you'll know why. My brain kicks in about 4 p.m. in the afternoon. And honestly, you know, I can be super productive in the evening when it's quiet. Some people are night people, some people are morning people. But the world of work generally doesn't accommodate that. So we have a structure that says, you know, these are the core hours and the rest of it. And I think actually lots of people they're just unproductive in those core hours. And I think the more that we can flex, actually not from an employee benefit perspective, even though we should be doing that, but just from a productivity perspective, which we know the UK is shocking in terms of productivity. I think actually that's where, you know, employees and individuals will really get that sense of meaning, that kind of sense of kind of, you know, the psychological contract will be increased. So I think regardless of whether you have children or dogs or whatever it is, I think employers just need to just be a bit smarter. And one of the things that just frustrates the hell out of me is, well, what are you doing if you're not in the office? Well, you know, let's treat each other as adults actually. And I think we're still in a kind of adult-child relationship when it comes to the world of work. And if we continue that way, a lot of people will. I used to work for an organisation actually many years ago, and I just thought, you're treating me like a child. So what did I do? I left and set up my own business. And I think lots of people will continue to do that because we're saying, no, the way that you groove doesn't groove in the way that I groove. And I think that's just the reality of life actually.
That might be quite a good time to open it out to you and the audience. I wonder if you've got any experiences of this or have any questions. Yes, right. Oh, yeah. And Jess, thanks.
Hi, my name's Mark from a company called Wilson Cook. We're a brand digital marketing specialist just around the corner. And just the point you're making there around the kind of work-life blend or balance, or how it wants to be determined. One of the key things we try to adopt is that level of flexibility within our kind of workforce. For example, the reasons that you've been stating there. One of the challenges that we've had with that is the way we approach it, we had quite extensive conversations, kind of like consultation with the team. So in our regular team meetings, we talked extensively about what flexibility or balance actually means. But it often heavily focused on the life side of things, as opposed to also retaining that balance of the fact that commercially you've still got to be effective as a company, you've still got to hopefully be profitable, be actually, the purpose of it being that you're bettering work as well as the life, that makes sense. The balance has got to be both sides. So we found a real heavy focus on it all about the life. So this is why flexibility needs to happen, so that person X can do this or do that in their own personal life, but not really very much said about what that actually then flip side means for the business. I'm just wondering if you've got thoughts on, I mean, we're kind of continuing to work through this, and from a leadership perspective, it's really hard because you have that, you start to think, right, well, is this balance correct? Is it actually a balance, or is it skewing a bit too far on one side, if that makes sense? I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts on whether you've seen that in the past, how you've got through that, how you've actually then come out the other side and found that kind of balance, I guess, if that some way makes sense.
Question.
I'm happy to take that. Yeah, and I actually run my own business as well, so I've got a similar approach. We don't have anybody in our organisation that doesn't work flexibly. And we've reflected on this a lot. We also work at a distance quite a lot, so there's quite a lot of time when people are just the only person in the office because everybody else is out on client side. The key is two things, I think. The biggest one being, and Dan mentioned it in his opening notes, is giving the people within the organisation a sense of purpose about that organisation. So rather than the parent-child relationship in terms of you own the business, and the child in it, it's giving them a sense of purpose and belonging about the commercial reality of that business funding their life and your lives. And that's really, really important that we involve them in those discussions and share those tensions and stresses about running a business in the modern world.
And give them that accountability,
Giving
them
them
responsibility.
Accountability is the second one, absolutely key. And in smaller businesses, that's quite challenging because you've normally got an entrepreneur at the top. I'm the entrepreneur in our business, one of them. I'm STEM 9 controlling my personality profile, so giving over control and accountability is a real challenge for me. As I've got older, I've got better at it, but my top tip would be sense of purpose, openness about the challenges of running a business and why they're there, and accountability for their role in fulfilling that. And yes, we can be flexible about how we deliver it, and yes, we respect people's lives outside of it. We've set up a social committee, which some of our newer members of the team have set up, and that's been massive for us in learning more about each other. But fundamentally, when we're at work, we're there to deliver to each other respectfully and accountably to enable that business to thrive so we can all live our lives productively. And that's the dialogue that needs to happen.
Great, thank you. I mean, we've been around for 30 years as a company, so we've got such huge amount of history, and it means cultural change takes such a long time. I've been there for 10 years, and through that 10 years, it's like shifting the tank, in fact. It just takes so long. And this is another one, you've got all this history. Like I was in Lewis for a meeting, I came back and got back in the office at 4 o'clock, there's 3 people in the office, you kind of think, okay, where's that employee? So it is this mental shift from the leadership, just to think, just forget about it, just get on, just trust it's going to be there. But like I say, it's that the time it takes to shift culturally is really, it's a long time. But also the idea being that the end goal is going to be really, really meaningful in the sense that we're going to be far better than we were yesterday.
Absolutely. But Sheri's point there in that context is absolutely key around accountability. So setting goals and trusting people to be accountable to them, but making very, very clear direction so that you're not assuming one thing and they're assuming something else, and therefore nobody delivers in the middle. And it's a different way of it, it's a different style of leadership.
The communication has just got to be king there. I mean, you can't leave anything to doubt. And it isn't easy, and I think a lot of businesses are still trying to figure out how this is going to work, but just, at least you have started it. You can't expect change overnight. I don't think any businesses that do change their culture achieve it overnight. They make some mistakes along the way too, but I think as long as your communication is clear and everybody's still working towards the same goals, and the business wants to achieve and stuff, then hopefully you can find a way to accommodate everybody.
BT is the big example there.
Okay, great.
And BT is where they shut their buildings down to save money, and they save millions and still do year on year through getting rid of their buildings. And I asked Caroline Waters, who was then the head of people at BT, how did you get an organisation with that entrenched culture to go to distance working, essentially? She said, what, we tried everything, and in the end we just said, take a leap of faith and let's see how it works. Wow. And that was an organisation of that size, and sometimes you just have to push the button and say, we're going to put a change in place and let's just run with it and see how it works.
Be bold. There you go. Any other questions?
Hi. Take it next step then. You say about cultures changing within organisations. Have you got any tips for those who are impacted by the clash? So in my situation, I was hired because I'm a bit of a disruptor, and they wanted me to be the new culture person. But everyone in the layer between me and the seniors still wants to be the same old culture. Have you got any tips for someone like me?
We've all got a few words probably that we can give to your
Leave now.
Yeah.
I guess one of the tips is around actually, is actually really understanding how decisions are made. Decisions are not made in meetings, basically. Decisions are made outside of meetings. So one of the tips that I would say is, if somebody likes you, you'll go far. So I would work on relationship building. And once you build relationships with individual stakeholders within organizations, that's where your potential to disrupt will be greater, actually, because at the moment they're probably in kind of group think mode, and they've got bonds between themselves, and you're currently the organizational outsider. So you need to move from that kind of outsider to insider status. But what I would do is something very simple: have lunch, have coffee, have a drink with those kind of key decision makers. Let them get to know you, and that's where you'll really kind of be that much more effective in terms of that instigator of change, basically.
Because some of their reluctance might be fear, because essentially you were a threat, and they don't understand why the managers have decided that they need a disruptor. So to get them to understand that you are actually doing something that's going to help the organization as a whole, that it's not about them as individuals no longer being desirable, the flavor of the month, but that you're trying to create organizational change with a purpose that will benefit everybody. That should help. So to turn your foes into your allies, really, and to do so with a bit of charm and wit, and sharing the reason why you're disrupting, not just causing chaos for chaos' sake, but because there's a greater purpose, that is organizational effectiveness through diversity, inclusion, and that kind of thing.
It's giving them a voice. I'd just add to that is that understanding, I always say, to judges to discriminate on many levels, let's understand where the other person is coming from, why they're entrenched in their views, what their vision for the organisation is, and then manipulating that into what you're trying to do. So you're giving them the voice, and then you're disrupting in their goal, as opposed to cutting across their opinions, which will divide and alienate.
Yes. Thank you.
Good morning, my name's Selma A. I'm 60, by the way.
She doesn't look it, does she?
Having worked in big blue chips and now in the digital sector, do you actually believe that large, structured, hierarchical organisations built in a particular model with a particular bureaucratic base and focused on structure and stability are capable of diversity and inclusion?
I'll answer that. Without question, they are for sure. And I know it's difficult when you're in it, but if you take an analysis, just take a big thing. If we think about how attitudes were, in the 1950s, for example, to women, to people with disabilities, to people who were lesbian, gay, bisexual, to people from different races, it was a completely different world. And even though change takes time, change does happen. And I think that's a really positive message, because when I analyse organisations over decades, you see that they are capable of change, but it just feels like we're not, because it just takes forever. And we're in that kind of sticky kind of glue, and we're trying to make things happen, and it's hard work. But I do think they are, and I think they are in particular in two scenarios. One scenario when something radical happens, so when there's a big disruptor in the marketplace, that can be a driver for organisational change and the rest of it. But the other thing is slightly more softer, is I do meet leaders today who understand that how they think and how they feel is not going to future-proof their business. And interestingly, I do think there's a bit of a change going on in the global landscape, actually. And I think some of those big global corporations, I mean, back to the conversations around millennials and things, I think some of those global corporations do understand that they can't continue in the way that they have. They don't necessarily have the skills to change themselves, but I do think now there's an increasing desire. So I'm sort of on the positive edge where I think they can, but I think we just need to have a reality check in terms of how long it takes.
I'd go one step further and I'd say that they haven't got a choice if they want to survive. The way that technology has impacted the world means that we are just much closer to people who don't look like us, don't speak the same language as us, don't worship the same God that we do. So the changing landscape of the globe means that even these large corporations aren't immune from the requirement to be diverse. If your workforce does not reflect your customer base, then you're not diverse enough. And the customer base is increasingly less white, middle class, and male. It looks like all the people in the room. So I think they haven't got a choice if they want to still be these large companies in 10, 20, 50 years.
Great, thank you. Anybody else?
Hello, I feel like you can.
Check out the room, it's good, isn't it? Yeah.
Wow, it's very busy. Hello. I'm speaking from sort of a little bit of a different angle, really. I left the RAF after 23 years with a diagnosis of PTSD, and I was applying for jobs everywhere. I wanted to get to the point where I was well enough to do so, and nobody was responding because I was declaring PTSD. And I thought, well, I want to work again. I've never worked, and I did a little bit of a test where I applied for 6 more jobs, declaring PTSD. And then I applied in my sister's name with her permission before anybody jumps on GDPR, with exactly the same CV, just a different name and different date, and not declared PTSD. And she got requests for interviews, and I got 1 out of 6. So there's still a lot in there, and I was told I'd never work again, basically. But I've set up my own business. If anyone wants to talk to me later, I'll be there. In mental health, because I basically got pushed back because of my diagnosis. So kind of, I'm a bit nervous, look at me shaking. So kind of, there's still a lot in there, and for me, it's about how do I push myself to encourage businesses that actually have still got a lot to offer.
Yeah, so I can empathise with that. I mean, I'm partially sighted, so again, it's hidden disability, so I'm completely blind on the left and partially sighted on the right, so I can get away with not saying. And interestingly, I was at a client premises on Monday, and I walked in very breathless. I'm on a lot of steroids to try and protect my remaining sight. That's also why I'm round, which is fine. And in some commercial context, I go without somebody as a travel buddy, and I will arrive really almost hyperventilating on arrival. And I feel comfortable enough and safe enough in some corporate environments for that to be okay for me to explain it. But in others, I actually have a travel buddy to make sure that I get there in that different state. So to me, if you're hoping that, I work in the field of disclosure. For me, as an employer and an employee, the more we know about each other, the better able we are to connect and to be successful. So not disclosing as part of the recruitment process, and therefore bringing a hidden challenge and life circumstance into the workplace is only going to end in disaster. But it's working with looking for employment through organisations such as Page Group, such as other organisations in the recruitment sector, who are now working with their clients to make sure that it's about capability and it's about talent. And if we have something about ourselves, whatever it is, that impacts on our ability to shine through the recruitment process and at work, we have the right measures in place to adapt to those, whether that's 5 minutes break, having a glass of water before we start, whether it's managing the lighting. And me walking through that room, I found that very challenging. So I normally network, but when there's 300 of you, I've got no chance because my brain's going to overload. So my hope to you would be, we are increasingly seeing organisations putting adjustments in place and being open and understanding. 5 years ago, we did a survey and less than 13% of candidates being offered any adjustment or got interviews on the back of having disclosed a disability. In this year's survey, that figure's gone right up to sort of high 60s. And we're also finding in our celebration of disability in the recruitment process that the adjustments category is now the highest, it has the highest number of subscriptions, whereas in the first few years, people just didn't know what they were. Your challenge is, people don't understand it. I mean, I'm sorry to point out the hotel, but I walked in with a white stick yesterday, and the girl at reception froze. And I got closer and I could see her thinking, if I don't notice it, I won't actually have to respond or do anything about it, and it'll just go away. So she had her head down, did everything like this, and then said, the lift's over there. And I had to say to her, I don't know where over there is, really. You're going to have to be more articulate. But it's, you have to, unfortunately, confront other people's fear and nervousness around the terminology around disability, and maybe put more in it. So you're disclosing the disability, but talk about the impact. And I manage this by, and that my ability is, and I want to see you because, and work through agents such as Page Group who can bridge that gap successfully for you.
Yeah, I think there's a big thing about you have to become comfortable making someone else feel a little bit uncomfortable, because otherwise nobody's going to move on. And there's disability confidence scheme, which is what employers sign up to. So actually, by declaring, you are bumping yourself kind of straight up for interview and things like that. So there are schemes out there to help you. Did you want to add to Ngozi? Sorry, something you looked like you were going to say something.
No.
Okay.
I think Kate summed it up perfectly there.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Thank you. I'm Nathan, and I'm a HR consultant here at Page, so plug. I'm passionate about D&I as a whole for a couple of reasons in particular. So my background is sport, and I particularly see within gymnastics, in a predominantly female sport, women being dictated to in quite an inappropriate way by men, as well as my mum actually being black. So I have a particular passion in this area, as well as being a recruiter for D&I positiveness. And with the conversations that I'm having with a lot of my network, they are typically raising whatever anecdotal evidence is the fear to, how shall I put this, to offend. So how do we look to really try and go against the barrier that can sometimes create, especially when we don't have sponsors or leaders that really do kind of actively support those strands?
So are you talking about, Nathan, how do you as the minority go against that barrier, or you as the majority? So how does the employer get past that barrier, or how you as an employee? Because for a long time, I think the emphasis has been on me, the minority, speaking up and saying, I don't think I'm included, I feel uncomfortable, I think there might be a race issue at play here. And that's not right or fair. The emphasis shouldn't be on me to say, I think that there's an issue here with race. It should be on you, the leadership, saying, well, clearly there's an issue with race because we haven't got enough non-whites in the room. So that's where I'd come from. But then to your point, it's about just open communication. So if it comes from the leadership, if the leadership can recognize this is what we're aiming towards, is, as I said, your workforce reflecting your customer base, and the customer is not one person. Why does it not look that way? And start the open discussion. So it comes from how we model that discomfort, and the leader has to just step out of the comfort zone into that position of, yes, this might be an awkward conversation, but failure to offend by mentioning the difference can result in someone's real career progression being hampered. So I think the responsibility should be from the top, and not from the onus shouldn't be on the minority or the affected party.
I think language is a massive barrier. And again, this is something that we come across very, very regularly. people who find them to discuss. I do, because I work in the field of disability, I work across diversity, but I work in the field of disability, I'm known for that. People tie themselves in knots trying to get the language right, so end up going in case they've said the wrong thing. And I think it's a really good investment. You probably already do it at Page Group. Lunch and learn sessions with some experts in the field to just discuss language, do's and don'ts, things that offend, things that don't offend, but above all, giving somebody permission to get it wrong and to say sorry and to ask the question. I mean, there's lots of case law, as Ngozi is alluding to there, for people who have been discriminated against because the conversation hasn't been had. There is no case law that I'm aware of where somebody said the wrong thing by accident, apologised for it and sorted it out. So have the conversation. If you feel you're with a colleague and you don't quite know how to address them, ask them.
Yes, it's not difficult. I am conscious of time. We'll take one more question if there is one. And I'm like, oh, everyone's like, me, maybe.
Hey, good morning. My name's Goodyear. I work for a business called Red Eye. I just want to say, first of all, thank you to Michael Page for this. Really informative. My question is to the panel. Kate, you rightfully said in order to create a more inclusive workforce, you need to ask those difficult questions. Now, Ngozi, my sister, representing you rightfully touched upon some of the biases that exist for people of color. And I'm assuming they exist as well for people who are Muslim, Jew, homosexual, etc. So obviously there's those biases that exist and they're preventing people moving up the career ladder. So my question essentially is, how do we move away from the really well-written policies and actually do something about it in the real world? So it's great to have a diversity inclusion policy, that's great. My question is, how do we actually move away from that and start actually doing something about this? Is it that the world isn't ready for where we want to go as a human race? Or what are some of the things we could do to actually practically in real life address this issue?
The first thing I'd say is look around you. Look around your organisation. And do you truly see that it is a mixed population? If not, and look at every level of hierarchy as well, because people get very comfortable saying, oh no, yeah, there's loads of black people in this, but they all work at a certain level and they've not progressed upwards. Or yes, there's loads of women, but they're all in HR and not also in the engineering side. So have a look around. If it is not the way that you think it should be, then start putting those policies in place by asking the questions. Why not? Why don't we see more even distribution? And that's not to say that you should have 100% anything in one area. I'm not saying it's 100% women at the board level or whatever, but why don't we have a wider spread? Start asking the young questions. But as I've always said, it really does, it does matter who your leaders are. And the other thing is to recognize that everybody, absolutely everybody, has an unconscious bias. I have one, I'll happily admit. I'm sure I have many. We all have it. It doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a person. But basing decisions such as recruitment, progression, all of that on those unconscious biases, now that is bad.
Yeah. It's knowing, is it? It's
yes,
knowing that's what you're doing.
Exactly. So make yourself aware of what your bias is. It's not a question of what do you have a bias? What is your bias? And make yourself aware of it, and then do something about it. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but it's really it's on the leadership to start saying, this is what we want, this is why we want it, and we're going to start those conversations.
I think, I'm a really big fan of data actually, because data can shine a spotlight on where you're doing great and where you need to improve. So there are some really, really practical things that organisations can do. First of all, just the notion of just saying we all have unconscious biases, just by saying you have a bias helps you to de-bias your own behaviours. But the thing that I would say is shine a spotlight on, first of all, the recruitment process. So, look at who's applying for roles, who's being shortlisted, who's getting through. So do the analytics and then put some KPIs around that, because what gets measured gets done, that principle. The other thing that I would say is you can move it's really interesting actually, because it goes back to the question earlier about can we see change happening? If you look at some of those big institutions, well, first of all, like Page, PwC, EY, without question, we've seen loads of positive change in those organisations because they're looking at some detail. So, for example, they're looking at performance management scores. So who gets what in performance management based on race, gender, etc. And they'll really shine a spotlight and then either put mentoring or sponsorship around that. So I would say put a spotlight on recruitment, work allocation, and performance management in particular, and then KPI those three things. And if you've got some metrics around that, that's where those organisations are more successful. And finally, reward leaders that do good things. Those organisations that are aligning reward structures with D&I are seeing traction for sure.
I'm going to wrap it up there, and actually just on that point, that is something we have introduced at Page for the first time this year. So all of our MDs globally have got D&I targets attached to their bonuses. So just before I sort of close off formally, I just wanted to say part of the survey that we did then produce an inclusivity mapper and an eBook all about inclusion in the workplace, which is all on our website and you are free to use. So it's some really good information. Dan actually spent a lot of time working on this and putting it together with us, so it is well worth a read, and it can just help you identify what's going on in your organisation. I know the question really could have gone on, and I can't thank you all enough for your input. But most importantly, thank you very much to Kate, Dan, and Ngozi for their contribution. And the final takeaways I would say are amplification. I love that one. Really do big people up, and if there's not someone in the room who should be their voice. Make it count. And if you drink a lot of white wine, you look as good at Kate when you're 56. Thanks for coming. Enjoy the rest of your day.